Recording in progress.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session at the START Network Assembly on frameworks for change in the START Network. So good morning to all of you attending on the platform. And for those of you who this is the first session in the morning, welcome to day 2 of the START Network Assembly. So today I have with me 3 panelists who are going to be kind of presenting different elements of this work to you. We have Smriti Patel, Tanya Chung, and Eleanor Ndorito. I'll be introducing them to you as we go along through the session. But first, just to give you just a quick summary of the aims of this session. This session is really about introducing to you some work in progress that has been going on at the START Network. And particularly, we're going to introduce you to 2 frameworks that we've been working on, one of which is a framework for an anti-racist and an anti-colonial START network, and the other one, which is a framework for a locally led START network, 2 clearly very closely interrelated and important pieces of work. And we'll be kind of setting out to you what we've done and why we've done it and what we think is the way forward on those 2 pieces of work. And we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So please, if you have questions, fire them into the chat, and we'll try and get to you if we have time at the end of the session. But first, it's my great pleasure to welcome Smriti Patel. And Smriti is probably the perfect person to kick off this session. In 2017, she authored for the START Network, or for the START Fund, actually, a framework of 7 dimensions of localization for the START Fund. Smriti is also a co-director of the Global Mentor Initiative, which works with organizations and donors around the world, helping them on processes of partnership and collaboration and shifting power in particular, with a real focus on equity, inclusion, anti-racism and decolonization. She's been involved across the sector for a long time in the Charter for Change, the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, the IASC, and particularly working on prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse at the IASC. And as I said, she authored the framework for the START Fund on the 7 dimensions of localization. So welcome, Smriti. As I said, you're the perfect person to talk to this. And since you wrote that paper in 2017, of course, a lot has happened. The sector has moved a long way. And it'll be fantastic to hear from you a little bit more about what's changed since then, what's moved on, what have you been working on, and what are you seeing across the sector in these, particularly in these areas of working on locally led humanitarian action.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. And really great to be here again to share some of the things that are happening, that are emerging for us. So I want to start firstly with, having really the honest conversations are really, really key in terms of what could emerge for the whole issue on localization and locally led response. So it's a pleasure to be back here to just share with you what's emerging for us. And since we developed that framework of 7 dimensions, it's almost 5 years on, and a lot has been done. We've been doing some country studies in 10 countries. And what I'll bring you is really from those kind of reflections from local leaders, international organizations, and the system as such. So what we see is actually more and more people are talking about the complexity and all the different social issues that are existing in their workplace in the different countries. And so there's more emphasis on how can we do more collaborative work if we really want to make sure that we are able to really respond to what's at country level. And then what really comes out, and this is through this latest research that we've done, is actually before the national crisis, actually local actors are already working there in terms of civil societies, national authorities, and others. It's when the crisis hit that internationalization happens. And what I mean by that is big international organization, the machinery arrives, and this comprehensive response that comes to the country, and that's where internationalization takes place. And then over time, it's thinking about how can we ensure that local actors are again in the lead. So we now talk about localization by design or default. What we mean by that is that many times after internationalization, after a big response, international actors leave either because there's no more funding and then there's localization by default, or that they cannot reach the population because of security or other things, and so it's local leaders who are taking the lead. So this is a really important issue for us. This is something that's really come up very strongly in the research we've done. And actually what it means is we need to make sure that localization is by design and plan for it and make sure that there is strategy for it, instead of running out and leaving local actors dealing with the situation that's been created by internationalization. This you'll be familiar with already, 7 dimensions. This is how we kind of came up at the beginning. So how have we moved forward? I think this diagram here was really in the second part of our work with Start Networks, to look at how can you do this more systematically and how can we work system-wide, because I think that's where a lot of the issues are. There's a lot of ad hoc progress, but the system-wide progress is missing. So how do we make sure that our overall response, that the way we work system-wide and we have capacity to better be prepared to maximize participation of affected population and really reinforce local capacities. And really, when we make strategic decisions in the collective response, how do we make sure that we reinforce, again, not replace local capacities? And what will make our organizations better prepared to do this? So really more systematically institutionalize how we work with in different locations. And I think that's the biggest gap still at the moment. So we started delving a bit deeper, and this is what's emerging in the last 2 years, is how can we do more system-wide approach? So there's a structural change. So what we are now looking at is, yes, there are always these issues around how do we have the right policies and strategies in place, the resource flows and practices. We've talked about this a lot over the last 5 years, but our attention right now is more on relationships and connections and power dynamics. Unless we deal with the power dynamics and the relationship issues and equitable relationship, nothing is going to shift. But we're actually more focused now on the mental attitudes and working a lot more on getting people to reflect on their power. So internally in organizations, how are people working with each other? We are so focused as a humanitarian sector, we much focus on doing, and we are very good at doing, but how are we at being with each other? Because depending on how we are being with each other in the organization and with the affected population and with our partners, we'll say how we work with them, right? So more reflection on power is absolutely key. And then after that, really looking at, okay, where are the power dynamics? How are we showing up when we are working in solidarity with partners? Are we on equitable terms? How do we behave with them? Just yesterday, I was talking to somebody from Iraq, and he was really talking about the way, even the language that's used, the way, the attitude of the person speaking to the local leader from the international organizations or international actors generally working there, is really problematic. So how can we make sure that we think about more of these mental models, the prejudice, the judgments, the perceptions that we have, and they come from some of the two things I think really key: fear and mistrust. These are, across all our 10 countries that we studied, this is one of the key things that came out. And fear does not really bring our best potential, right? So the constant concern over risk and creating risk, we don't achieve, we don't achieve our best when we work with fear. An exclusive focus on fear really fuels pervasive distrust, and that really leads to dysfunctional collaboration. So we really need to make sure that we don't focus on that. Distrust really often is a starting point, and it remains dominant in the atmosphere in the partnerships. And distrust also carries really high costs, right? It reduces value for money. So in a way, we feel that trust reduces cost controlling, and equally important, it enables co-ownership and shared responsibility. When I say distrust is high cost, what I mean is what we see in the system is sometimes we are spending $70 of $100 just to make sure that $30 is spent well. And that is real waste of money. So how can we reduce some of these controls and really be more contextual in the way we are working, I think, and to lessen the fear and mistrust. We keep thinking and talking about risk. We are really risk focused. So for us, the risk that, especially the risk that we don't count, are the risks that we've been investing in capacities for so many years, yet it's not sustainable, right? And do we count that? Because that's waste of money. The second one is really this comprehensive capacity approach that we have. It does not leave legacy, or which is significantly strengthened at national level. And again, that means in the next crisis, again, that assistance is needed. And the third one is the risk in the relief sector. It really undermines the development of local and stronger local civil society. We have so many different programs and projects around supporting civil society, but I think when the big international assistance system arrives, it undermines the local governance as well. And I think we undermine the participatory governance that we are normally advocating for. So one of the things we think is a really, really big issue is how we actually listen to each other. So there are lots of conversations that have been happening on localization, but it is very much internationally dominated and led. And I'm not sure that we are really truly listening with a deeper mindset. And by that, I mean really with an open mind. It's not just about noticing the differences. It's really about being more empathetic when we are listening with an open heart, so that we see things from the other person's perspective, and that we then have an open will to be able to change things. So our focus now is a lot more on what kinds of conversation that are happening, the quality of the conversation and the listening. We have really started a couple of programs actually called the Bridging the Divide and Power in Organizations, which really help people to deal with that. And we've done this in INGOs and also donor agencies in Germany, and we're starting work also in the Netherlands and other places. So this is what we think is going to really shift the system, and not just focusing on policies and procedures. We've also come up with a framework which helps a bit more deeper looking at the maturity of partnerships. So if you look at this framework here, it goes from the fear-based, as I said to you earlier, fear does not increase good work. So it goes from the fear-based all the way to service-based, and really gives you an idea of the range of ways of partnerships that are happening at the moment, and where do you need to move from the fear-based partnership, which is really all the time focused on financial survivors, due diligence, organizational security, and that's kind of the driver. And sometimes what we see is the relationships are not bad, they, but there is very much a feel-good factor. It means that there's little room for honest and critical feedback. And I've heard this so many times. And I know that local actors, for example, hold back from giving critical feedback because they're scared, afraid, and they fear that their funding will be withdrawn. Of course, there is this reason-based relationship, right, which really looks at how do we solve problems together, the data, based decision making, all of that. But actually, majority of the focus is on avoiding mistakes, and we know that taking risks and mistakes also makes innovation, right? So very much avoiding that. So the purpose-based relationship is really about being driven by a higher purpose, really grounded in shared values, trust. So I'm really emphasizing trust here, and the appreciation for complementarity. For me, complementarity is really, really important. We keep talking about it, but what we see at the moment is often the national organization who complement the international organizations rather than the other way around in terms of supporting and reinforcing capacities. So we really need to pay more attention on what complementarity means. And then, of course, the last one is the service-based one, relationship that's really based on in the service of the community in terms of broader well-being. We keep talking about people at the center, but how do we really practice that in our relationships with partners is really, really key. So this is one of the frameworks that we're actually trying out with organizations. And what we think is the way forward is really to adopt a more comprehensive systems perspective, really looking holistically at how we are going to start working on this, not just ad hoc approaches I talked about before. Take a broader time perspective, because we're always working on a very short time frame. And every time 6 months, 1 year is even not enough to really talk about capacities. Develop a vision of change. And what I mean by that is, what does success look like at the end? I don't think we spend enough time on that, and a joint vision on that. And that's really important. And then, of course, then having the right indicators to measure that success, because again, that is also missing. And then, of course, most final thing, interrogating the power and privilege, racism, exclusion, lack of diversity. All of these things have come up in the 10 studies we've done at country level. And each time we see a pyramid, and at the top is the donor, and at the bottom of that pyramid are the local organizations or the grassroots organizations. So even internally in a country, within maybe even national and local organizations, there can be exclusion and inclusion issues and lack of diversity as well. So we really need to interrogate the structure that we have at the moment to see where the power and privilege is, and help people actually to reflect on that consciously and be really present to that. And then looking at how we move forward from that. I'm going to leave it at that, because I'm sure there are some questions. I've gone quickly because I know this is just kind of a starting of the conversation. So in a way, we have moved from a very practical framework, and it's still a valid framework because we use that as the basis. And we say, in the 7 dimensions, what do you need to do to get there, right? And for us, this way forward is how you get there. You really need to delve deeper in terms of attitudes, behaviors, and looking at how we can shift those mental models. Then only we are going to be able to get any further, because having any kind of frameworks, the feedback we've had, even from the INGO staff, is you keep introducing new and new frameworks and models and all of that, but it's not giving us the chance, when once you have one, to actually really implement that. and the time to think about it and being able to reflect the changes. And then suddenly there's another framework. They've got so many different frameworks. So I think really, I would say we need to think deeper about how we are making these changes. And if we are going from the individual power, then looking at the organization, this is the only way we're going to make a difference. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope it's given some food for thought in terms of the way we should be working.
Thank you so much, Smriti. There's some real wisdom in there that you've managed to pack into about 15 minutes. So thank you so much for that. I see some questions are starting to come in. We're going to hold the questions until the end, so please keep them coming in the chat, and we will get back to those at the end. And lots of stuff I'd love to pick up on there with you, Smriti, and some stuff I think, particularly that piece at the end there on interrogating power and privilege, that kind of feeds into some of the work we've been trying to do in the START network. I would like to bring in my colleague Tanya to talk a little bit now about kind of what we've been doing since that work in 2017 within the START network, within the START network, particularly on this piece around what does it mean to be a locally led START network. Tanya, I'm just going to put the slides up and hand over to you. If you just give me 1 second to share the screen.
Thanks, Neil.
Which has, of course, disappeared. Just give me 1 second. Slight technical glitch.
No problem. Maybe I can just start.
Yeah, just start. And it's coming up in about 10 seconds.
Sure. So yeah, to set the scene, late last year and through to this year, START Network was working on a strategy refresh with the main aim of really centering localization and local leadership within all aspects of our work and our strategy, really working to bring greater coherence across our initiatives as a network. So as part of that work, we felt there was a need to better understand what we meant by a locally led START network. What would it look like? How could we begin shifting our mindsets, our practices and policies to really make that transition? And perhaps picking on some of Smriti's language, that localization by design. And then that's what led to this framework. And I know she just said there's too many frameworks, but this is where we are. And so hopefully we can kind of stick with these for a while and really embed them in. So it has been a process of iteration and adaptation, hence the title, and to really stress that this framework is a starting point. So it's intended to help us collectively really build a model of what a locally led START network looks like, and to support each different parts of the network to hold each other to account. So you'll see here on the slide that there are 11 elements. It really builds on the earlier thinking that Smriti did with the 7 dimensions of localization. So now we have 11. We kind of branched out in thinking about what issues were really important to us as a network, and some of these things you'll see mirrored or similar to many other frameworks in the sector currently. So to just talk you through some of them, you'll see there's a series of political elements. So there's governance and decision-making, voice and visibility, and leadership and ownership. Some of the issues are more structural. So there's funding, resourcing, and donor engagement. There's compliance and risk. There's also partnerships. And then we identify 3 more operational areas. So there's accountability and learning, design, and costs. And lastly, 2 cross-cutting areas around language and then ethics and standards. Next slide, please. So this framework is set out as a series of intentions and questions around those 11 elements. So you'll see there's an intention behind each element that you'll see here, and it really sets out a vision of where we want to be or where we want to get to as a network. And so if you were to read one thing in this framework, this overview page would really be the most important one, as it gives you a sense of that overall direction. So I'll talk through a few of these to give you a better sense of the content. So maybe picking up on some of the things that Smriti drew out around risk. There's a section here on compliance and risk. It's in orange in the middle. And it states, the network reframes its approach to risk and accountability, grounded in principles of trust, shared values, pooled risk and reducing barriers to entry for local and national members. And this really speaks to that disproportionate and controlling approach to risk in the sector that Smriti highlighted as conversely increasing costs and undermining relationships. So this is our attempt to kind of address that. Another intention I want to highlight is around leadership and ownership. It's in the sort of peach color at the bottom. And it states, network decision-making programs and initiatives are locally led with local and national actors supported and resourced to take on leadership roles. So that sounds nice, but what does it really mean? It was really important for us to go beyond these kind of platitudes and really examine what our intentions meant and to support each other to make real shifts to change. And that's where the more detailed intentions come in. So that's in the next slide. So each element is broken into a more concrete set of intentions. It basically is just to break down what we really mean for each area. And so on the left, you'll see the more detailed intentions. And on the right-hand side, we pose some questions for ourselves to think more practically about how to make each intention a reality. And it's really tapping into that mindset shift, that internal thinking and reflection that we need to do. And so these are questions that Start Network needs to answer at all levels, at leadership, at management, staff, membership, hubs, etc. And so the idea is when we're embarking on a new initiative or facing an issue, looking at how to improve our practices or monitoring and driving forward our strategy, we reflect on these questions and really challenge ourselves on how we are living up to our intentions. So here's an example, sorry, if you stay on, here's an example of the leadership element I mentioned previously. So you'll remember there was quite a high level intention around decision-making, programs, and initiatives being locally led. But within that, there are much more specific intentions we want to be held to. So I'll talk through two of them. So the first one you'll see at the top says that local and national actors hold the power on decisions which affect them within the network. But to make that a reality, we need to think much more deeply. So for example, how is Start Network ensuring that local and national actors have the space to influence and make decisions? How is the network backing them up? How to ensure that non-local actors aren't holding back these decisions and locally led change? And so we haven't prescribed answers to these questions as they're quite context specific, but we felt it was really important for people to internalize the mindset of supporting change and really think through these questions for themselves. But at the same time, we've also tried to be more concrete and prescriptive where needed. So for example, the next intention states, new programs and initiatives are only implemented where they are majority locally led. Existing programs and initiatives are reviewed to ensure greater inclusion and influence of local and national actors. So when reviewing this, the teams were asking for much more clarity. What does it mean for a program to be majority locally led, especially as it features now within our KPIs? So we have co-designed some minimum criteria towards locally led programs to help guide our programs in a much more practical and coherent way. So I know that was a lot of content, and still it was only a snapshot of the framework. The framework is available in the Learn corner on the platform under the strategy and leadership section. But we also were, if there's interest, we were thinking to hold a series of webinars with you, the members and the hubs on this locally led framework, as well as the pieces that have emerged from it, such as that minimum criteria towards locally led programs that I mentioned, to really discuss and consult with you on the content in much greater detail. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tanya. Thanks for going through that. It obviously is quite a long document, and thanks for just picking out the highlights there and giving us the super quick summary of that. We'll come back to you in a moment just to kind of understand how some of these initiatives fit together. But I'd like to hand over to Eleanor, who's been centrally involved in working with Arbi Bagios at ADRI Imagined to help us develop a sort of a sister framework, if you like, on what it means to be an anti-colonial and an anti-racist Start Network. And Eleanor, maybe you can talk a little bit to that piece of work and how that's going forward, and you know, what's emerging from that piece of work.
Sure. So yeah, thanks, Neil. Thanks, Tanya. So perhaps you could skip to the next slide, please, Neil. Great. Yep. So we're hoping not to create too many frameworks, but alongside the locally led framework that Tanya's kind of shared with you all, Start Network has also been developing a decolonisation framework. The aim of this framework is to help Start Network, our members and teams, understand the many ways in which racism and colonialism affect our work. So as we look to transition into a network of networks with a dispersed governance structure built around independent hubs, the hubs will help to expand the network by bringing in more local and national organisations based in their own countries. It will also mean that the network's collective action can focus primarily on support to local responders. So through this structure, really, our aim for the network is to be locally led, and through the framework, we hope to challenge and influence the impact of racism and colonialism in our work. So as Neil kind of alluded to, towards the end of 2020, we really started kind of looking inwards, and we commissioned Arby Bourgeois, founder of Aid Reimagined, to support us to build a framework, which was kind of developed through a series of desk-based research, a review of our internal and external documents, and focus group discussions with BIPOC colleagues and members in the Global South. So I'll kind of give you a whistle-stop tour of kind of the main takeaways from the framework. But if you look to the circle to your left, so that's kind of that deep pink circle, we can see that the organisational and sectorial pressures are both influenced by racial and colonial dynamics from the wider society. So this results in donor-driven decision-making within the organisation and an imbalance in the way in which we operate, which prioritises being agile, technical, managerial, and cost effectiveness. This lens kind of results in bias, and this resulted in the following three key concepts, which have been categorized into the three main areas, which are judging, universalizing, and controlling, all of which kind of lead to inequality. So to counterbalance these kind of organizational pressures, the circle on the right, so that's that green circle, the framework suggests applying a lens that balances this with some ethical standards. And these are categorized into the following. So that's being careful. So what does that mean? That means giving enough space and time for meaningful engagement and being more mindful and intentional in doing things. Being political, asking who or for whom and whose criteria, and looking at the dynamics of power and identity surrounding an issue. Being relational, so valuing trust and relationships, as well as in seeing embeddedness and connectedness as desirable, and it also leads to greater delegation. And also being material, so recognizing the material requirements towards being anti-racist and decolonial, including time, money, and energy. So essentially, with all that being said, in carrying out these reparative actions, the idea is that each one of us can create a more just environment that is inclusive, equitable, and recognises the contributions of our colleagues in the Global South, and those are identified as BIPOC. So I think that's it from me, but I'll just kind of give a short plug to tomorrow's session, where at 10:30 we'll be kind of delivering a build session that will explore many of these concepts in much greater detail.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eleanor, for again going into what is quite a complex framework and giving us some real insight into what lies at the heart of the model that was developed as part of that work. Let me maybe just bring you back in, Tanya, if I may, just to kind of, obviously two sort of parallel frameworks. If you could just say a quick word for us about how these kind of fit together and how we're thinking about using them going forwards, that'd be fantastic.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, so if you can do next slide. Yeah, we've been thinking about this, right? Is this potentially one framework too many? Are there too many things going on? Potentially, yes. We know that these frameworks tackle very similar issues, admittedly with different starting points and slightly different directions, but we're very open to seeing how they may adapt and evolve and potentially converge over time. But for now, this is how we are distinguishing and holding together these frameworks. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's a visual of how they come together, and it's essentially speaking to different levels of influence and thinking. So at the macro level in dark blue is the individual and system-wide mindset and ethos. And that's what is addressed in the anti-racist and decolonial framework that Elle talked us through. And at the network level in orange are more of our organizational policies and practices. And that's what's addressed in the framework for locally led START network, because it really reflects on the aspects of START network that needs to change to enable locally led action. And then at the programmatic and operational level in green, there's an ask for more specific and practical guidance to bring the above frameworks to life. So an example is that minimum criteria towards locally led programs that I mentioned, which breaks down the concept of locally led programs into discrete, practical, and measurable criteria to guide shifts in programming. So that's how they come together. Back to you, Neil.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much just for that quick bit of insight. Tanya, so we've got some questions that are starting to come in, and so I've got one for you here, Smriti, if I may sort of start off with you. So a question from the floor is, we can notice that there are some contracting relationships between international and local actors for years and years that are still on the fear-based level, contractual relationships, I guess, that are still on the fear-based level. How can we encourage that relationship to be enhanced? And if I might add to that as well, one thing that I've heard quite a lot of people talk about, even over the last day or so in this conference, is how some of that kind of culture of fear that you talked about actually is kind of almost set at the donor level, and people sort of pulling their hair out going, how do we change that when, you know, some of this culture of fear actually sort of almost comes from a place that's hard for us to control? So I wonder if you had any thoughts about how we sort of really dive into that fear and risk culture.
Sure. So some of the fears, so we've been really interrogating these fears. Where is it coming from? And actually, and I think you touched on it a bit earlier, it's also through some colonial mindsets, right? And what I mean by that is that, of course, you know, the colonial mindset in terms of international actors is the authority, you know, the kind of top-down approach. But our colonial mindset in terms of local actors is also that we wear that whole thing. We've been told so many times we don't have capacity, so we think we don't have capacity, right? So this is the thing over time. This fear is so deeply ingrained that it's, you know, unless you work on it really consciously, it's not going to go away. And that needs two parties to come together to talk about this. And actually, you know, we keep talking about, oh, it's about the donors. We have to work at different levels. Yes, donor is only one player, but actually the relationship with international and local organization is their own business. It's not the business of the donor, right? You do it for a purpose. And if you don't invest in the trust building, and trust is really about sharing, right? If you don't build it, if you don't put enough time in that, that's when the fear thing starts, right? And you start hiding things and unintentionally, and then that leads to suspicions and things like that. And I've heard many of these stories in our webinars that we did on partnering in the German network, right? So, you know, we need to be intentional about that. And then I would say local actors also need to work on their mindset. You know, they have capacities and they need to value them, right? And be intentional about pointing that out with their partners as well. And I think the understanding can be there. We've seen that when we've done these dialogues between international and national actors, and we get them to really listen to each other in a quality way, suddenly something shifts and they start saying, yeah, you're right. So what we did is we got national and international actors coming together to look at, for example, their assessments, and then get them to interrogate how inequitable it is and start pointing that out. And suddenly the other side thinking, oh, wow, yeah, this does sound really bad, right? So it's really about sitting together and in a trusted conversation and an honest conversation that can, you know, bring this together. I also noticed a question about, you know, international and national staff of international organizations. I think, and I will put the article in the chat here. You know, I've said in that article that actually these attitudes are not only for mindsets of international staff, it's also local staff of international organizations who actually become the biggest blockages for local actors. And that has coming really widely from many different locations, and in all the 10 countries this came up. So it's also about that mindset, because they start behaving like their international star, because it's the international attitude. It's that culture, right? It's the culture of the organization that's seeping through. So this is why we have to really focus more on organizational culture and attitudes and behaviors. Policies and procedures are kind of, I think it's a tick box thing, personally. Unless you really make sure you focus on the attitudes and power, that's where you'll get the results.
Yeah, thanks so much, Smriti. And I think some really interesting reflections there. I think, and on that issue of capacity, I think Arby makes the point in his framework. He says that actually what we need to do is start recognizing the inherent capabilities of our partners rather than trying to change them and give them different capabilities. And that actually we should be talking much more about making space and creating the space for those inherent capabilities to emerge or to be recognized, rather than trying to change people's capabilities. So that's a really interesting one.
I think, sorry, just to put, it's about valuing the capacity, right? We put so much more value on compliance and due diligence and all of those things. We don't put enough value on things that they can really do. They can connect with the community, they know the language, they know the context, but how much value do we put on that? So that's really important. Thanks.
Thanks, Smriti. Tanya, if I could come to you, there's a question in here about, what does the framework, the locally led framework, mean for sort of members of the StartNet within the INGOs? Is this something we're hoping will, sort of be adopted also by our members, and how does it affect our programs and so on? I wonder if you could say just a quick word about that.
Yeah, sure. So this framework was designed with Start Network and its members in mind, with the hope that this would be adopted by the Start Network team as well as the members, particularly when operating under Start Network programs or initiatives, but ideally also beyond. And that is part of where the hubs come in as well. The ideal end goal when we were designing this was that hubs would own their own local versions of these frameworks and be able to use it to hold their members to account, whether the international ones, local, community level ones, etc. And it would be something that they would co-own and really be able to use to influence the different types of international and different types of actors involved in their hub, because we know that some international NGOs are thinking much more about this, maybe the ones who have engaged with Smriti's work, but some not so much. And how can hubs be part of influencing that change?
Great, thanks, Tanya. We just have a couple of minutes left. Eleanor, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Look of fear. You talked about the framework, and you talked about that central piece in the framework of kind of doing that analysis and looking at the balancing forces and how we kind of balance this donor-led perspective with more of a diverse and ethical perspective. I wonder, like in practice, what you think are kind of the big challenges of doing that? Like, when we really come to it, when we really come to apply that, what are some of the things that you think are going to be really hard for us to kind of, and how we might address them a little bit? Sorry, it's a really hard question to fit into 2 minutes, but just maybe one or two things that come top of mind for you.
To be honest, I think the key thing is holding ourselves to account. Really, that framework is really about our individual actions and those kind of those key, like being careful, be political, like we all have to kind of pause, because I think in an environment where we work at such speed and kind of emphasizes those kind of being agile, being technical, we have to kind of hold ourselves accountable and really like pause and reflect and ask ourselves, is what I'm doing careful? Is it political? Is it relational? And I think that's the only way we can really then start to kind of counterbalance some of the issues that we kind of do see within both our organisation and the wider sector at large, really.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for those closing words. A really good point to end on, I think. So I just want to flag, as people have mentioned, there's a couple of great sessions coming up where you can dive into this in more detail. There is a session at 4 o'clock today, I think, which will go into more detail on the anti-colonial framework and actually take you through an exercise of using it and getting familiar with it. And that will be repeated tomorrow morning for people who can't make it today. It's going to be a kind of a repetition of the same session, so you don't need to go to it twice unless you really want to. And then I also wanted to flag quickly at I think 1 o'clock today, or maybe 1:30, there is a boardroom with Loop, an organization that is working on a mechanism for accountability. And I believe there's a few places left in that. If anybody would like to sign up, you just go to the boardrooms tab on the platform on the left-hand side. So that's it from us and for this session. I just want to do a massive thank you to Smuti for joining us today and making time to be here, to Tanya and Eleanor for those excellent explanations of the framework. And thank you everyone for attending and being part of this session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.